I thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Ojibwe, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. My name is Carrie Linklater, and I am your chairperson this morning. And I am joined on the panel via Zoom by Ms. Gail Anderson and Mr. Kevin Stephenson. From the assessment department, we have Mr. Jamie Forger, and our administration personnel is Mr. Tristan Breeden. We'll be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The board is appointed annually by City Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony, followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. And as information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. This morning, we will be hearing items 3, 5, 7, and 8 on our docket. And Mr. Breeden, would you please affirm the assessor and the applicant's testimony? Thank you.
Mr. Assessor, please state your full name.
Jamie Fougere.
Do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Awesome. Mr. Applicant, please state your full name.
Rod Slaughter.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Beautiful.
All right. Good morning, Mr. Slaughter, and good morning, Mr. Forger.
Good morning.
We are going to start at item number 3, which is 1525 Dublin Avenue, and we are looking at the assessed value. And Mr. Forger, whenever you are ready.
Right. So we have a verbal recommendation for this property here. I had sent it along sort of late afternoon to Mr. Slaughter. So I just wanted to go through that real quickly. The roll number for this property is 13001290200. The address is 1525 Dublin Avenue. And the original 2025 assessment was $3,186,000. And we're proposing a recommendation to $2,769,000.
And what is that recommendation based on, Mr. Forger?
It's based on a reduction in the net operating income.
All right, I thank you. And Mr. Slaughter, are you willing to accept this recommendation?
Madam Chair, I haven't had a chance to speak to the client, but with respect to Mr. Fougere, and I very much appreciate his attention to the assessment, I would like to continue our appeal, please.
All right, I thank you. Proceed, Mr. Forget.
Sure. So if you want to turn to the second page of my brief, you can see photographs of the subject, 1525 Dublin Avenue. We have the aerial photography at the top and and below as well. And you can see Omans Creek runs alongside the property, so that portion isn't really developable there. And it does make for a little bit of a lower land to building ratio, meaning typically you might see more land with industrial properties. And then you can see the property on page 3 of my brief. These are Google Street View images. And you can see the one is photographed from Dublin Avenue and the other from Orange Street. And if you turn to the 4th page of my brief, we have the two tenants that are there and their rental information. So both units are actually the same size, and that's something that came to my attention as I was putting the brief together, that one of the units we were low on the size. We had it as an even 10,000 square feet, but we'll get to that in just a moment. And then on the 5th page of my brief, we have comparables. Now, there is a lot of comparables in the immediate area. So I tried to hone in based on effective age, square footage, and wall height. So these are all either storage warehouses or flex warehouses. And just to point out a few that would be maybe most similar to the subject, we have 1421 St. James Street receiving 835 on their 2 units that aren't as large as our 10,000 square feet units, but they are larger units. And just working our way down, we have 1692 Dublin Avenue, about halfway through the page, 1988 effective age. The subject is 1990, so that's close there. And they're receiving $10 a square foot on just over 5,000 square feet. I should also mention that the wall height for the subject is 21 feet high. So most comparable would be those kind of in the 20 to 22 feet high wall height. And so you can also see several units on 1347 Border Street, and they range from $6.25 up to $8. Similar in size, but they are older, so 1977. And then we have 1717 Dublin Avenue, further down the page near the bottom. And those range from $8.50 to $8.75. That's an older building, even though with a lower ceiling height, I should note. So you can see on page 6 of my brief, this is the workup of the original assessment. As part of my recommendation that I would, still make, I would propose reducing the rents to somewhere in the vicinity of $7.50. To recognize some of the less desirable features of this property, such as the smaller land to building ratio. And that would give us a value of $2,769,000. And as mentioned, both units are 10,125 square feet. You can see at the top of my page 6, the premise there that we have is 10,000 square feet, but it is in fact 10,125 square feet. And yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to pause here for a moment. Mr. Breeden,
Yes.
I am hearing conversation. Is there?
Okay. Yeah, there is a
From the
hearing
other
going on
room?
behind us. I
All
will try to ask if they can bring the volume down a little bit.
All right, thank you.
Of course.
Mr. Slaughter, questions for Mr. Forget?
Just a few. Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Fougier, thank you for the presentation. Very thorough and a good analysis on the market rents. You had mentioned right off the top the fact that this property, which has a relatively low land to building ratio of under 2.4 to 1, actually effectively has an even lower land to building ratio because a good portion of the western side is undevelopable because of its proximity to the Omans Creek. Is that correct?
Yes, and in fact, I did a little calculation in preparation for the hearing. It's approximately 2.18.
Thank you. Would that land to building ratio, the effective one of 2.18, would that have a bearing on an investor's expectation of return, or in other words, the capitalization rate? Do you think that would have an impact on it?
It may. In lieu of that, we are recognizing that difficulty through the rents with our recommendation. But certainly, I think you could come at it the other way with a higher rent and a higher cap rate as well, effectively coming to a similar conclusion. Sure.
The cap rate applied, correct me if I'm wrong, is 4.95%?
That's right, yes.
Okay. And on page 8, you have the city's summary of capitalization rates.
Right.
And if we look across, it appears that 3 of the brokers, their marketing reports in which they cite approximations of capitalization rates for various properties. I don't think we disagree that this is not a Class A industrial. Is that correct? This would be Class B?
More than likely, I would suspect.
Okay. And you'd agree that in the broker reports that are shown, Colliers, CBRE, and Cushman Wakefield, this is in the second box down for industrial on the chart on page 8. Industrial B appears to range, depending on the broker's opinions and probably depending on their universe observed, between 6 to 7% or 6.5 to 7.5%, basically. That seems to be the range, correct?
Correct.
So you'd agree that 4.95% is a significant amount lower than what we'll call the floor of what the brokers are reporting?
In terms of what they're reporting, that is correct. I would agree with that.
Thanks very. Oh, go ahead.
Just in terms of history with the property, I am aware that last cycle we had the same capitalization rate as part of our recommendation at the hearing, which was adopted by the board, just to give a little bit more of a picture.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Mr. Fougier.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, any questions?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Fougier, in regards to the recommendation, so you've changed the rental rate to $750, and is that based on the 20,250 square feet then?
Correct.
Okay, and so what's the new NOI, the net offered?
So the new NOI would be $137,044.
Thank you. And if you could just provide a bit more background in regards to the cap rate as to what would go into it, the factors that would go into it, you know, again, just to reiterate, it does seem a little bit low, as the applicant said, at 4.95. When I look at the table, the 20th percentile for industrial B on the city's table, the city's rate is 5.35. So why this property might fall below that? I just need to understand that.
Right. So the quality, the size, the construction type, the location within the city, those are sort of primary factors that would influence where the cap rate would be situated within our analysis. In terms of why this particular property is outside of the is below the 20th percentile, I don't have a lot of information regarding that. I would suggest it's well situated. It has, you know, it is an industrial park. The construction is good. Looks like it's concrete block construction, or concrete construction anyways. And it has good frontage, good windows. At the property has parking at the front and the rear, and it's 1990. It also has wall height of 20 feet, which is desirable for warehouse space. And there is some a little bit of a yard to the rear of the property as well. So I would suggest that it has maybe some challenges, but it's also fairly well appointed in a way. But that's all I can suggest with regards to the cap rate.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Those are all my questions.
Thank you. Any questions, Mr. Stephenson?
Mr. Fougere, have you inspected the property yourself?
I have not.
No?
I typically work in the retail section, and I've been asked to help out with industrial docket here today.
I think my other questions were pretty much answered, so thank you. No further questions. Thank
you, Mr. Stephenson. Mr. Fougere, I'm just going to point out that your comment when discussing with Mr. Slaughter concerning the previous assessment and the cap rate is going to be disregarded by us. So
okay,
I just wanted to make that clear to both you and Mr. Slaughter. Thank you. I just have you discussed the 2.18 effective land to building ratio. And what is the ideal?
Depends the suitability for the occupancy, but I would suggest something closer to I believe 2.8, 2.7 is what I would suggest, at least for flex warehouse.
Okay. And given the age of the building, it is, you know, almost 35 years old. So would that not be affecting the cap rate here?
It would be. Effective age is definitely a component of how our capitalization rates are calculated. In terms of the overall inventory of flex warehouses, we saw quite a few of comparable properties in the area, ranging from the 1960s to the 2000s. So on that sort of time horizon, you could view it as a little bit more recent. It appears to be in good condition, but beyond that, you know, it's still 30 years old, you know.
34.
34. There.
Every year counts, unfortunately. And your cap rate is model driven?
That's right.
All right, thank you. And I believe that is all my questions. Oh, sorry. I know you yourself didn't inspect the property, but do you have notes on when it was last inspected?
I did not review that prior to the hearing.
Okay, so you can't speak to the condition of the building then?
No.
All right.
Aside from my observations from the exterior.
Okay. So then I'm going to assume you can't speak to, because it's two premises, correct?
Correct.
So do they both have sort of loading, those, the large loading doors in the back? And I'm just wondering about the height.
Yeah, so certainly one of them does, I believe, based on the aerial photography on page 2 of my brief. Unfortunately, the roll number kind of blocking the image on one of them. The wall height, I don't think would be an issue because it is 20 feet high. I'm just taking a look here.
Yeah, it was hard to see in the photo.
Yeah, I do apologize for that. You can see on the lower photograph, there does appear to be a semi-trailer backed into the building. So to me, that would probably indicate that there are loading docks there. And this is a flex warehouse building, so that would make sense to me. I'm just gonna take a look at something here, sorry. Yeah, so it looks like there's maybe 4 loading docks at the rear of the building. Possibly 5, but it's a little bit difficult to tell on one of them.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Mr. Slaughter, if you would like to proceed, please, with your brief.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So we have 2 documents I'd like to go through this morning for this property. The second document I'll just go through for this property, and then it'll pertain to the others. So I'd like to start, please, with the main brief for 1525 Dublin. All description. And I'll skip ahead for brevity because Mr. Fougier had described the property quite well. And in this location, I'll call it the St. James industrial location, you have a relatively homogeneous industrial stock. It's varying ages and there's going to be varying ceiling heights, but generally you're going to have a fairly standard type of property. And this would fit into that category. Most of the ages in this area are between 30 to 55 years. You find newer product when you get into the more commercial areas of St. James, Century, King Edward, and St. James. But in this area, it's more of an industrial. So we have the overhead on page 6 of the property along Dublin on the north side, abutting Orange Street on the east, and as mentioned, Omans Creek on the west, which actually effectively erodes the usable land to building ratio. And then we have an aerial photograph on page 7. There are 2 tenants in place. One is Berensden Fluid Products, and the second is ALS Canada. Mr. Fougier and I both had a bit of a confusion on that because I thought they deserved an exemption, but in fact, it's not the ALS Society that I thought it was. It's a different industrial tenant. So therefore, I don't know if I mentioned, Madam Chair, but we had an appeal on classification and liability, and I would like to withdraw those, please.
All right, thank you.
So on page 11, we start our analysis via the income approach. And we start with the market rent. And so, Madam Chair, usually what we do in an approach, I think is pretty close to what Mr. Fougier mentioned as the approach of the city, is that we, in a fee simple analysis, we have to determine market rent. And the best indicator of market rent, according to most appraisal texts, is to look to the subject property itself. But then you do an analysis, or you check through various boxes to make sure that the rents in place are considered market. If they're related parties, for example, they would not be considered market. If the lease is extremely old and has been stepped up over, numerous years or a decade or more, that might be questionable. And in those cases, what you do then is test to the market. You say, well, if the actual is this, but we have concern about how market it is, what is happening in the market? So on page 12, we've done a very similar analysis to Mr. Fougier, and I think we're probably going to have very similar conclusions because of the fact the industrial stock in this location is relatively homogeneous. You have a little bit of a tighter range than I typically see for industrial on the market rents in the area. And our focus is strictly on Dublin Avenue itself. And of course, there are factors that are going to influence rents one way or another. And Mr. Fougier mentioned many of those. Ceiling height can be a factor. The amount of land that's available for parking or access for trucks will be a factor. The ability to have larger trucks navigate into the loading areas will be a factor. The number of loading doors could be a factor. Nothing stands out as particularly detrimental for this property. It's suitable in all those aspects. Mr. Fougier was correct that there's 2 grade loading doors and two or three, I think there's 3 dock loading doors. And the favor of the amount of loading actually goes to ALS. They have a slightly larger grade loading door, and I think they have the 2 docks versus 1. The other factor that you'll see that really varies in a location like this is the amount of office finish. Sometimes these industrial flex properties are basically an office. And you'll see that in the rent. You'll see a higher rent. That's where we get closer to the, $9 or $10 a square foot. And you'll see that this morning on some other properties. But on page 12, we look through the market rents, and it's a similar range. It goes from about $5.50 or $6 up to around $10 a square foot. And your average in both cases will be around $7.50. I mean, in case of the city's evidence and ours. So you're sitting around $7.50, somewhere in there for your ranges. We go back to the actual rents in place on page 11. And for the 2 tenants, and Mr. Fougier is correct, they're 10,125 square feet each. The first tenant is paying a rent of $8.50 a square foot at the reference date, and the second tenant is paying a rent of $8.02 a square foot. Now, Madam Chair, there's something I discovered after filing the evidence. I had gone back and I had investigated what was happening to the first tenant's rent after what appears to be an expiry just before the reference date. And in fact, the rent continued, but at a stepped rent. So the rent stepped from $8.50 to $9 in January 1st of 2023. And I will be concluding my presentation with a slightly revised value, Madam Chair, because I'm going to recognize that stepped rent of $9 for the first unit.
All right.
Okay. Okay, so that is the analysis very quickly on market rent, and it's relatively simple here. We have 2 tenants, they're new leases, they're representative of what I believe is characteristic of this type of property. We looked at the comparisons, we go check, it makes sense to the market. Then we move on to the vacancy allowance. The city has applied 4.5%. We have a whole analysis, Madam Chair, I'm not going to go into because the conclusion is, yeah, that we agree with that. We usually aim for about 4%, so 4.5 seems fair. Shortfall rate. For industrial properties, you don't often see much discrepancy. $4 a square foot seems to be reasonable when you count the recoverable expenses for CAM and tax, so no contention. Non-recoverable expenses was an item that we used to feel very passionate about, but frankly, it's depends on where you recognize this, if it's in the cap rate or the non-recovered expense category itself. So in other words, we're agreeing with the city in the lower expense ratio, but this is something that we now have to consider in our capitalization rate because we're taking away basically the risk of non-recovered expenses for an owner buying a property. We're taking it out of their NOI calculation and we're leaving it floating, which means it falls into the capitalization rate. in a simple, short way of saying this, our capitalization rate should be higher than it otherwise would have been if we had gone for the typical 7% non-recovered. And so that brings us to capitalization rate. And we do have a separate study, Madam Chair, and maybe I'll ask the panel to please refer to this temporarily. And I'll go through just very high level, because you asked some good questions earlier about what are the things that we need to look at in the capitalization rate. So I'll just pause and let everybody to refer to that second document.
Panel, is everybody on the document? You've got it, the cap rate study?
Everyone's good?
I'm assuming.
Okay. So I'll move fairly quickly through the presentation. On page 1 of the study, we talk about what is a cap rate, and just I'll break it down very simply. It's the rate of return expected on a stabilized year 1 income that a purchaser is buying. It's not that different than when you purchase a stock, and what is the rate of return that you'd hope to achieve on that annuity. It's an annuity, and this is what you expect to gain. We have guiding methodology on the derivation of capitalization rates, but I don't think I need to go too in depth into that. We usually bring this up if we think something's been done inappropriately in a calculation. So we start with, there are fundamentally, I mean, there's many factors that influence capitalization rate, but really appraisal texts often will break it down into 3 categories. So again, we've gone through the exercise of determining a stabilized year 1 annuity income. So now we know what that is. Now we're saying, what are we going to pay for it? So the things that are going to influence our determination of the return that we would like are, number 1, what is the return on similar investments? Not similar investments, other investments. So in other words, if I know that I can go to Scotiabank and get a risk-free government bond, 10-year bond, or a GIC, and I buy that and it sits in my bank and I make 4.5% in a year. That is what we consider a risk-free investment. And that becomes basically the floor for an investment. Because if you are now going into something tangible as your investment, like real estate, where it's less liquid, it comes with other risks. There's other myriad factors which are going to influence your potential income stream. Your desire for a higher rate of return increases with all those factors. So that's step 1, is understanding what are alternative investments commanding, and where do we think that's going to go. And that speaks to the second and third. I'm going to blend the second and third concerns into one, and that's basically, what is the feeling in my stomach about this stabilized income I determined? I think I'm going to make $200,000 hypothetically on this per annum. Where is that going? What's happening in the market? What's happening in industrial? What's happening with supply and demand? What's happening in the world? What's happening with tariffs? What are all the things that I think are going to affect or put risk to my income? And as my stomach feels more uneasy, my capitalization rate increases. So those are fundamentally the factors we look at. What we need to be careful about when valuing a property is that you don't want to double count factors. For example, ceiling height is something that I, as an investor, may be concerned about for the longevity or sustainability of my income, because I know that more and more tenants and industrial are requiring, a minimum ceiling height for storage. But it also is a factor in what the tenants are going to pay for the space. So in other words, have I already recognized ceiling height as a characteristic in my rental income? And I want to be careful about kind of overdoing it by now saying, oh, we have to increase the cap rate as well. So while we definitely look at physical characteristics in the capitalization rate, I'd suggest that oftentimes, if we recognize that in the rent, we should be fine. So Mr. Fougier made a point. I'm recognizing a very detrimental feature with the proximity to Omans Creek and the erosion to the usable area in the rent. And I would say, well, that's fair. But there are factors you're missing, because I, as an investor, when I purchase a property, in that expectation of appreciation of the income that I want, I feel handcuffed because part of my site does not have any development potential for increased parking. Let's say I have a different tenant move in who has a higher staff count or perhaps even a commercial customer count. And they say, we're only paying you $8 if we have sufficient parking. And I'm handcuffed. So these are things that are definitely risks for the future of the income stream, and I think need to be recognized in the capitalization rate as well. So I thank you. That's a very, very, very high level sort of view of how we look at capitalization rates. So let's back up and talk about that very first factor, which is if I'm going to buy this property, well, I can get a GIC right now in April 23 for 4.5%. And this is a very important factor when we look at the market. And I know, Madam Chair, you said let's not look backwards to what happened before. But in fairness, what has happened since the last reference date, April 21 to April 23? And if we look at this one factor, which is the return on alternative investments, or the cost of borrowing, basically, it has gone up significantly. On the bottom of page 6, we can see what happened with the Bank of Canada overnight rate. It was at an admittedly artificially low. Nobody expected it to stay that low. That was basically panic because of the pandemic, and the Bank of Canada reduced the overnight rate so low to entice any activity economically. But as soon as the pandemic ended, everybody knew it was going to start going up. What they didn't anticipate is the amount of inflation that started to happen. And of course, as soon as inflation starts, the Bank of Canada typically will react by increasing interest rates. So it's something that happened, but it's also something that most investors were recognizing was going to happen. I don't think anybody realized how far it would go by April 23. The Bank of Canada rate went from 0.25, I'm sorry, up to 4.5. That's a significant increase, and that has an effect on capitalization rates to an extent. Let's talk about that effect. It's not a one-to-one ratio, but it is an effect. On page 7, we see how an increased overnight rate by the Bank of Canada influences mortgage rates. So a 10-year mortgage rate, you can see, rides fairly close to the overnight rate. And so as the overnight rate goes up, so too does the bond rate. Then we go to the next page, page 8. So now we've talked about the overnight rate. We talked about risk-free investment rate. What does that do to cap rates? And it's inevitable. The theory is inevitable that it will also push up cap rates for all the reasons I mentioned. And we can see that on page 8. What it doesn't do is work on a one-to-one ratio. Cap rates usually lag behind. So as interest rates shoot up and bond returns go up, everybody knows cap rates are going up, but you might not see it, on that day or in that month. It happens usually a few months after. And we can see right at the end of that chart on page 8 that it is starting to go up. On page 9, we look at historic industrial cap rates across the country. So please keep that in mind when looking at the rates, because this is including Toronto and Vancouver and locations that are typically 200 basis points lower than Winnipeg. But the point is, what is the trend? And everything I just mentioned is seen in this graph. The industrial cap rates between Q1 21 and Q1 23 increased approximately 75 basis points on average. Now, I say all of that, but we have to then put it in context of the local market and other factors influencing that asset class. And the fact is, in Winnipeg, industrial has been performing quite strong. Vacancy is relatively low and demand is relatively high, especially through 2022. So that effect of increasing borrowing costs might not be as drastic as it would be on, let's say, office or retail, but it still is having an effect. And the fact is, demand, while strong, started to change a little bit in late 22. The biggest example was Amazon closed one of their 2 warehouse facilities in Winnipeg. That was rather shocking. And that opened up quite a bit of vacancy. And it wasn't just that they closed one facility. It's what did that mean in the overall picture? It meant the activity being driven by people being at home during the pandemic and the demand on industrial rather than retail to bring products to market was starting to pull back a little bit. I mean, it's still strong, don't get me wrong, but it's pulling back a little bit. The other thing that's happening on the supply side is we have a huge amount of activity outside of Winnipeg. in the RMs of Rosser and McDonald. And that increased supply continues to grow. So actually, that very rosy picture that we talked about in the industrial market, well, I think it's still very strong in Winnipeg. It is starting to taper off. This is another thing to consider. So we talk about industrial land supply. I won't go too far into this, Madam Chair, but it is in the report for anyone's interest. And then we get to the meat and potatoes. So this is all the background. What does this really mean, though, as far as capitalizations rates for industrial properties in Winnipeg? And on page 16, we summarize, just like the city did, what the brokers are saying. Now, we always preface an analysis that includes broker reports by saying, keep in mind, these are marketing reports. And while they're accurate marketing reports, these are top minds in real estate, it is what it is. So we don't put 100% weight on them, but it does give us some pretty good indicators of ranges, and it gives us indicators of trajectories. Are they going up? Are they going down? Are they staying the same? And when we look from the previous reference date to the current reference date, sure enough, we do see an increase in the capitalization rates for all of the reasons that I just mentioned. The increase isn't as drastic as I showed you on the national chart. That was 75 basis points, but it hovers. In some cases, it's static. In some cases, it goes up about 25 basis points. So what does that mean? Where are the ranges then? Well, we mentioned this from the city's evidence. It's pretty consistent among the major brokers that in Q1 2023, Class B industrial properties have a floor of 6%, and they go up to about 7.5%. There is no way that this property would trade with a 4.95% cap rate, with all due respect. Is the property a Class B? I think it's established it is. There are definitions, though, at the bottom of page 16 for your reference. And if you read those definitions, you'll see clearly that this is a Class B property. We then go one step further, Madam Chair. We actually try and test the brokers' reports with our own analyses. The reason we do this, well, it's not just to make sure that we're not being misled, but it's also because cap rates can be deceiving depending on the analysis that one does with the net operating income. For example, I had mentioned that Altus typically preferred to recognize a higher amount of non-recovered expenses in our stabilized income. And what that does is reduce the net operating income compared to somebody who didn't do that adjustment. And so if I as an appraiser and appraiser B look at the same property, the same rents, the same vacancy allowance, I have a higher non-recovered than they do. My net operating income is lower than theirs is. We look at the same sale price for that property in, let's say, October 22. And because my income's lower, my cap rate will be lower than his cap rate or her cap rate. And you can have all sorts of different conclusions depending on the method of analysis in the net operating income. So long story short, the other reason that I think it's important that Altus does this is because we want to make sure that what the brokers are saying is corroborated by our data in our methodology. So we've looked at 5 industrial properties that sold close to the reference date. I won't go through every one. This is on page 18. We have the previous studies cap rates on page 17. Page 18 is the current cap rates. And there are 2 which I think are great comparisons. They're very similar in style to the subject property and what I'll call Class B flex warehouse. One is at 1835 Burroughs Avenue, built in 1992, 30,000 square feet. And the second is 205 Hutchings, built between late 70s and 2005, 27,000 square feet. I think these are fairly good comparisons. And we do the exact same valuation methodology. Look at actual rents, adjust if necessary to market, apply an appropriate vacancy allowance, recognize if vacancy is being incurred in that property. In other words, if they had a high vacancy at the time of sale, we need to increase our vacancy allowance. Recognize shortfall, recognize non-recovered expenses, 3% we're using like the city. What are the cap rates, Madam Chair? 6.5 and 6.75%. That is, for lack of a better term, the nail in the coffin. we feel very confident in that conclusion and corroborated by the brokers that Class B cap rates should not be much lower than mid sixes, and they probably won't go much higher than 7.5. I think that concludes our analysis on cap rate. There's a lot of information here that is background to what I said in a very high level, but thank you for your patience on that. And so if I may, I'll now come back to the main brief for our conclusion.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. On page 19, we have our conclusion, but Madam Chair, as I mentioned, I subsequently found that one of the rents stepped up, and I will use that stepped up rent in our conclusion. What that does is bring the market rent higher from $826 a square foot to $869 a square foot. And with our capitalization, which the rate which we've applied, which I frankly think is very optimistic, we're at the low end at 6.25. That's about as low as I feel comfortable going. With my revised income and a 6.25 cap rate, the revised value, Madam Chair and panel members, please note, is $2,550,000. And that is the value that we respectfully ask that the board consider.
And what is your new NOI?
The new NOI would be $159,367.
I'm sorry, 367?
Yes, 159,367.
All right, I thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Fouché?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Stephenson?
On going back to your cap rate study, page 18, below the graph there, are you on page 18?
Yes, I am.
Where it says capital rate conclusions, can you summarize and explain those 3 sentences for me?
Based on the above, the average April 23 compression and capitalization rate for Class A industrial should be 25 basis points on the higher quality assets. So what we're saying there is, if we were to be looking to cap rates last cycle, if we were to think that that was an appropriate exercise, we should be at least 25 basis points higher. So if it was 6.5 last time, we think it should be 6.75. Then it says, based on the above, the average April 23 compression and capitalization rate for Class B industrial should be 0% on the low end and 25% increase on the higher end. So in the Bs, we're saying, yeah, there's a bit of a range. So I think for the worst of the lowest category, we're thinking that static might be okay, but anything else, it probably is creeping up by about 25 basis points. And this is basically due to the cost of money increasing. And then we say we have not seen any compression in non-investment grade properties. So what we define as non-investment grade are the ones that are, you don't typically see trade. They're not typically income producing. They may be, an owner occupied older facility. They still trade, of course, but it's not typically going to be on their income. And from our analysis, we're not seeing a great impact on those. To explain why, I'm not sure. I'd probably be hypothesizing. This is just simply looking at the data and the conclusions we draw.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, questions?
I have no questions. Thank you for your presentation.
I also have no questions. Does either party have a wish for a summation?
I'm fine. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm okay as well. Thank you.
All right. I thank you both for that. We will move on to item 5. Which is 1680 Dublin Avenue.
Right. I was just double checking that. Got the 5th item here.
And we're looking at assessed value. So, Mr. Forget, whenever you are ready.
Sure. So the roll number that we have is 0701-066-9000. The address is 1680 Dublin Avenue. So the assessment for 2025 is $5,513,000. And just taking a look at the property here, we have a land to plan area or land to building ratio, if you will, of 2.82. We have wall heights between 20 and 23 feet high, and the effective year built, or the actual year built, I should say, is 1988. And then you can see the property where it's located on the second page of my brief. And you can see it's close by Border Street, which we have as some of our comparables. And then you can see another aerial shot of the property at the top of my third page. There's 3 buildings here, one at the far end of the property, and then 2 with parking all around. And then on the 4th page of my brief, you can see there's 2 things I want to point out. We have the subject property leases ranging from as low as $5.50. However, that is one of the older leases at the property, up to $10 from 2018 from the Teamsters Union there. Then as well, we have the subject sale history. So this property sold in August 2020 for $4,200,000. And I did just want to reference as well that through my review of this property, we are perhaps on the higher side in our valuation. There are 2 outstanding municipal boards as well to be dealt with. So just in terms of a bit of a history of the property there. And then on the 5th page of my brief, you can see my rent comparables. Again, 1988 is our effective age built, and 20 to 23 feet is our wall height. And we have units of varying size. So just a few to point out, we have 1361 Border Street. We have a few comparables there, ranging from $6.50 to $9. And we have 1391 St. James Street, 1980 construction. These are smaller units, ranging from $8.25 up to $9. And then we have on Dublin Avenue, further down, about halfway down my table here, 1692 Dublin Avenue, some rents ranging from $7.25 up to $8. And then if you want to take a look at the 6th page of my brief, we can see there's quite a number of units here. And so our assessment, the rental ranges are from $819 up to $931 for the rent that's been assigned. And as mentioned, there's a variety of units here. You can see some of the smaller ones. The 1692 Dublin Avenue were similar in size. And then some of the larger ones relating to some of the other comparables that I had mentioned. And we have a capitalization rate of 5.5 on this. And then our assessed value is $5,513,000. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forget. Any questions, Mr. Slaughter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Fouché, so the You had listed all of the rents that are actually in place on page 4. These are the actual rents in the subject property. And the math on those rents, it would equate to about $7.55 a square foot. Agree?
That would that's true. I would suggest that we do have some older rents in the building with leases that are still in place. You can see the largest unit is also one of the oldest leases in the building. And so I would suggest that with an area so large as 10,000 square feet, when you compare it to all these smaller units, I would suggest that a date of 2015 is a ways off from our reference date, and a rental rate of $5.50 on what's probably close to a third or so of the area of the building would have a big effect on an average rental rate for the building.
Okay, fair enough. And then page 5, then, in order to test the accuracy of the actual rents, you have all the market rents, and they appear to range from $5.80 to $9.50. So a median, I didn't do the exact math, but we'd be somewhere around $7.50 is the middle ground in that range. Do you agree?
I would agree mathematically. However, I would want to highlight the most similar properties in my table here. So if you make an average of the most similar properties, I believe it would be higher, on the higher side of what you're suggesting.
The most comparable, the one you mentioned, 1692 Dublin?
Right. Amongst some of the others as well.
Okay, because 1692 is actually in the subject property, correct?
Right. That would make sense.
Yeah, I think the civic addresses go 1680 and up to 1692.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So, and you mentioned your concern about at least one of the rents, but just to point out the NOI that you're using, and I don't like doing this exercise because we're doing a fee simple compared to least fee, but it does sometimes expose when an analysis is over or under. Your NOI is $303,231, as showed on page 6, and you do have the income and expense mailer from the year end of 2022, and you agree that the actual income for the property is $261,000. That's quite a delta when we're looking at, pretty clean arm's length leases. Would you agree?
I would agree. I think I have a slightly different number for the NOI. But yes, I would agree basically to your scenario here.
Thanks. And then the same questions about the cap rate. The only evidence really that the city has is the broker studies that we talked about.
Correct.
Okay.
And a summary of our internal range there between the 20th and 80th percentile.
Okay. I think that's all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson.
Thank you. Mr. Fougere, what's your blended rate for rental?
I'll get that for you in just one moment. So $8.66 is the blended rate across the property here for our assessment.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you. And Mr. Stephenson.
No questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fougere, your cap rate, it's model driven, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And your vacancy rate, is that also model driven?
It is.
Interesting. Did you inspect this property?
I did not inspect this property.
Do you have any notes on when it was last inspected?
I did not bring that information.
All right, and you are classifying this as a A or a B building?
I would suggest that it's probably a B building.
All right, that's all my questions. Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, if you'd like to proceed with your brief.
Madam Chair, page 6 and 7, we have some photographs of the property. Again, I won't reiterate what Mr. Fougier has mentioned for the property. It is definitely a Class B. It fits right in that category based on its age, ceiling height, etc. The few and the land to building ratio 2.8. The few things I'd mention about the property, I've inspected it externally twice. I've seen a couple units in past years, but our notes from discussions with the owner, he brought up one thing that he finds concerning a bit, is that because of the configuration of the 3 buildings, it is difficult for larger trailers to properly navigate and access the loading. So you're kind of limited in the types of tenancies you have based on the types of loading requirements that they may have. So he feels that is a consideration which is in the back of his mind in the value of the property, and I wouldn't disagree. The other thing I'll mention is that with any property like this, a flex warehouse in these sort of areas, you will have quite a range in market rents, and we talked about that on the last property. But this property particularly has a few of these characteristics where one unit, for example, the Teamsters, and this is a hypothesis, I haven't been in the unit, but I'm quite certain that that's going to be a higher degree of office finish, which of course is going to command a slightly higher market rent. So there's going to be a reason why certain tenants command a higher rent. And then some, like ACS in Unit 1686, who are twice as large as the other units, that will usually, by economies of scale, bring the per square foot rent down. But it's also going to be a higher component, which would be the converse effect of not having a fully finished space. So in other words, I think there are reasons why the rents are what they are. And Mr. Fougier brings up a great point that the rent for ACS at $5.50 a square foot commenced in 2015. That's getting a little old in the tooth. But the fact is it extends until the beginning of 2025. And the rent that's in place is a step up. In 2020, you'll see our lease term indicates that it commences 2020. That's wrong. It's because one of the rent rolls we're looking at, oftentimes rent rolls will do that. They call the step up the commencement date. But in fact, it's a 2015 lease that stepped up in 2020. So the exercise that I have to do is say, is it indicative? Is there a concern that it may not be indicative of market? Possibly. Does it seem out of line with market when we consider all the factors about that unit, where it's located, its potential finish, et cetera, et cetera? I don't have the evidence to suggest that 550 is inaccurate. So therefore, if that's the rent in place at the reference date, and I have no solid reason to believe that it should be significantly higher, I can't make an adjustment. So our rent analysis, Madam Chair, is basically based on the rents in place. Why? Because I look at them, they all are arm's length. And when I look at the market, that seems to be a similar range, around 750 average. So we have applied slightly higher than actual. We've veered from 755 as the actual. We've applied 775. So one might say that that could account for a slight adjustment upwards in ACS, the low rent. We're at 775 a square foot, well corroborated by market. We have no contention with the vacancy allowance, non-recovered expenses, or shortfall. So the last item is capitalization rate, and I'll just simplify it by saying the same thing I did in the last presentation. There's no evidence for 5.5%, none. The evidence suggests between 7.5, and we are again at the lower range of that at 6.25%. I feel quite comfortable with that. So when we apply that to our NOI, which is 270,674, which is slightly higher than actual, although I don't want to spend too much time talking leased fee analysis, we would come to a revised value, Madam Chair, of 4,331,000 rounded. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Mr. Slaughter, I'm just confirming 4,330,000, correct?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I don't have that in my brief, do I?
No, you've
No.
got 4,218,000.
Yeah, that's right. I apologize. This is another subsequent adjustment, Madam Chair, so I can read you my revised numbers, please.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as mentioned, I had adjusted, I forgot that I didn't do this in the brief. I adjusted my market rent up to $7.75 a square foot.
Right.
That brought my NOI to $270,674. And then my value increased to $4,331,000. Apologies.
All right. Okay, thank you. Mr. Fournier, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
And Ms. Anderson?
I have no questions. Thank you for your presentation.
Mr. Slaughter, I just want to ask you, you mentioned that the owner said they were having some difficulty because I'm just looking at the land, sorry, getting the trucks in the back, but the land to plan ratio was 2.8.
And it was asked earlier, what is typical land to building ratios? I mean, the rule of thumb people usually say is 4-to-1, but no, that's high. For properties like this, I would suggest 3-to-1 is sufficient. 2.8 is fine. But I can see exactly what the owner is talking about. As I drove in between the buildings, you can see that there is some difficulty for the navigation of anything larger than, it's certainly a tractor trailer. And so that is a factor that we need to consider in valuation, because what it effectively does is limit your potential tenant
Correct.
supply.
Okay, I understand. So would you say then 2.8 would be the minimum?
Well, first, Madam Chair, I think it all has to do with the type of property it is and the configuration. I mean, 2.8 might be fine, but when you have it divvied with 3 buildings like they are, you have less room for the navigation of the loading trucks. But typically, if I had a facility like this that's 1 building and the land to building ratio would be 2.8, that should be sufficient.
All right, thank you, Mr. Slaughter. Mr. Fournier, I'm just going to redirect to you. Concerning that sale in 2020 of 4.2 million, was that an arm's length sale?
Indications from our department would be that it was.
Okay. Did that involve a REIT?
I don't have that information in front of me. What I can say is that from what I had seen, that it was reviewed and accepted. Information beyond that, I do not have.
All right, thank you. Mr. Slaughter, I'm going to direct that question to you.
Looks like he seized.
Tristan, is Mr. Slaughter frozen?
He does look like he's muted as well.
Thank you.
I think I got frozen there, didn't I?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just going to tell the panel right now, because I was called in on this hearing at the last minute. I'm zooming off my phone, so I can only see the person who is speaking. So that's a little bit difficult. So I couldn't see you, Mr. Slaughter. I don't know if you heard my question. It was just regarding the sale in 2020 for 4.2 million. And I'm just wondering if you have any information on it. Mr. Fournier has indicated that it was, best to his knowledge, it was arm's length. And I just asked if a REIT was involved.
It was a REIT portfolio purchase. Pro REIT sold the properties. I think there was 6 in Winnipeg, 5 retail in Quebec, in New Brunswick, and then there was some undivided interests in Quebec as well. That's about all I know.
Oh, all right. I thank you. Does either party have a wish for a summation on this property?
I'm fine, thanks.
No, thank you.
All right. At this time, I thank you. I would like to call this hearing back to order. We are going to move on to item number 7 on the docket, which is 1791 Dublin Avenue. And I note that there is a non-co-op, but Mr. Forget, you had some comments to make about the non-co-op before we proceed?
Correct. So we are withdrawing our request for non-cooperation penalties. It came to light that the owner had made attempts to submit income and expense questionnaires, but I guess there was maybe a problem with the email address they were sending it to. So we are satisfied.
All right, I thank you for that. If you would like to proceed with your brief then.
Sure. So the address is 1791 Dublin Avenue. The roll number is 0701 077 0500. And the original assessed value for 2025 was $4,754,000. We are proposing to recommend a reduction to $4,164,000. And that's with a revised NOI.
And that NOI is?
218,592.
I thank you. Mr. Slaughter, are you willing to accept this revised value?
No, we'd like to continue. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, I thank you. Mr. Forget?
Sure. So we'll begin by taking a look at the property on the second page of my brief. You can see a little bit of where it's situated. It's on the other side of King Edwards. And then on the third page of my brief, you can see the property a bit more. It's a bit unique. It has Omens Creek running through the front of it. If you want to turn to page, let me just take a look here. I thought I had a better shot. Yeah, if you want to take a look at the fourth page of my brief, you can see the property. It's difficult to use the Google Street View to see behind with the loading docks. So here it gives you a bit of a better idea of the space or the limitation of the space when you get to the loading docks at the rear of the property. And if you want to turn to the page 5 of my brief, we have a sale from 2018 for $3,420,000. And again, we're looking for a value of $4,164,000. And we have comparables on page 6 of my brief. And they are some of the same comparables from before. You can see at the top here we have 1391 St. James Street with some of the smaller units ranging from $9 to $9.50. Some more smaller units for the remainder in that table at the top, ranging from $9 and up to $11.25. And then you can see some of the larger areas, larger comparable spaces, larger tenancies in the area. These are all flex warehouses, as mentioned at the beginning. And they continue on to page 7 of my brief. And if you look at page 8 of my brief here, we have, there's a number of smaller units with 2 much larger ones. So we have, 1,600 square feet, and then as sort of one sort of size, which is why I separated the comparable tables. And then 2 that are much larger with 13,000 and 11,000. And we've used a 5.25 capitalization rate, and the resulting value for the original assessment is $4,754,000. But as mentioned, we are proposing a reduction to $4,164,000. And I had noted the net operating income. I can also say that the blended rent overall would be $7.85 for our recommended value. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, Mr. Slaughter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to start by making an apology to you, the panel, and Mr. Fougier. I had answered a question of yours regarding the last property, 1680 Dublin, and I was reading my notes from a different property. That I can't answer if that was a REIT sale. I was reading about a different property in Dublin. I just realized that as we went to recess.
All right.
Apologies. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
This property, I believe, was purchased by a REIT.
That's what I was reading. I had my next sheet open with the notes, and yeah, I was reading the wrong one. So, okay. So for questions, market rent ranges that you have on page 6. Similar question, Mr. Fougier. It's a pretty relatively tight range that we see. In this case, we see a new rent that pops up. You mentioned one on 1865 Sargent that really stands out as different. We do represent that property. And are you aware that that is the one anomaly rent in the property of 22 tenants with all other tenants in that tight range of $6 to $8?
I accept that feedback.
Okay.
Not aware particularly.
Fair enough. And I think that's all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Ms. Anderson?
I have no questions. Thank you.
And Mr. Stephenson?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Fougier, you are changing your value based on changing your rent per square footage, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And considering this property was a REIT sale, correct? How much weight are you putting on the sale price of 3.4?
I'm not putting any particular amount of reliance or weight on the sales specifically. It's more so a note of the property's history, and I think any sale should be kind of noted, whether or not it's relied upon. Primarily, I think just reviewing the property and comparable rents is where we've agreed or conceded some value and proposed the reduction to $4,164,000.
All right, I thank you. And your cap rate was model driven, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And this property has a 2.79 land to plan ratio, correct?
Correct.
So looking on your page 4, I'm going to say that the bottom half of the photo you have, that is where the creek is running through.
Correct, and that's not part of the property area at all, the site area. So it's just sort of if you're looking at page 4, that inner orange outlined rectangle.
Mhm.
It doesn't include the creek running through there.
Right. But the property is somewhat limited, I'm going to say, for any development due to the creek, correct?
Well, it's not part of the property.
Mhm.
And there are setbacks.
So I'll rephrase it then. I'm going to say it's a negative influence.
I don't know if I haven't done that analysis to bear that out.
All right.
It may be. I don't have any information relating to that. I can say that it's if there's any further development to the property, there would be required setbacks from the property line to begin with, and I don't know that those would be altered in any way from the creek. You can see the parking is relatively close to the edge of the property there.
Right.
In terms of limitations, looking at the site, it would appear to me that because the configuration, the narrow shape of the property, that backing in those semi-trailers, when that's done, you have to sort of do it in several stages. And I would suggest that they are probably relying on their neighboring property to be able to maneuver those in.
Right.
So that I could see more immediately as a limitation.
All right. That was my next question. So thank you for answering that. I have no further questions. Mr. Slaughter, if you would like to present your brief.
Madam Chair, so there's some photos on page 6 and 7, similar to Mr. Fougier's, and I was just listening to you both talk about the property, and you're both bang on. This is exactly what I was going to bring up. The interesting thing about the property, you can see this in page 6, it was designed as a single occupant, where you have your office in the front on 2 levels, rather shallow, and then behind that you have the warehouse, which they had extended. And it's really tight on the land to the true title of the land for the trailers, and you can see on the overhead. And Mr. Fougier had mentioned it's impossible, basically, and it takes some back and forth. I saw it happen to get the trailers in, and ultimately you have to cross onto the neighboring land. I actually don't know. I've never received an answer, or maybe asked the question properly, if there is an official easement in place. But certainly this would be a concern. If I was buying the property and I didn't think maybe my neighbor would be so kind, this would be a huge concern. And the other thing is, as you mentioned, you cross a little bridge over Omans Creek to get to the property.
Mm-hmm.
That was interesting as well. So at some point years ago, the previous owner, and we'd worked for them as well, had divided the property into multi-tenant. They lost their tenant. They had a 100% vacant building. And they thought, well, maybe we can divvy this up. So when you look at the rent roll, basically what this shows you is 4 smaller tenants, 3 fairly good offices, and 1 not so good office that constitute that front 2-story portion. And the good offices command, on the higher end, as we saw in the evidence before, they're commanding about $12 to over $13 a foot. And this lesser one only commands about $6.19 a foot. All of that makes sense to me. And it's corroborated by looking at the market for higher degree finish or basically office in an industrial location. And then the warehouse portions are at the back. And what's different about these than looking at typical rents is, if you look at the rent of a typical industrial, like we see, both Mr. Fougier and I have ample comparisons. And what you'll typically find with those comparisons is a standalone unit, right? You come in the front, there'll be a build out of 10, 20, sometimes 30%, depending on the size of office finish. And then you go through the back area and you'll have a warehousing or storage area, exposed ceiling, usually gas-fired heaters, a grate door, maybe a loading door. And what the rent will constitute from the meeting of the minds is all those factors, including the office finish. Well, here, what we have is the warehouse at the rear cut away from its existing legacy office. It's just warehouse. So we would expect that we will be at the lower end of a range. So when I see the rents of 675 and 619 negotiated and commencing very close to the reference date, I don't have a reason to believe that we should be increasing that based on rents that I know include something more than what the subject property units have. Therefore, the two-step analysis, look to the actual rents, determine if there are any flags. If there are flags, do you look to the market and find that the rents are inappropriate? That two-step process we've done, and we feel that no, the actual rents are likely what any investor would expect is their potential. See no reason to adjust it. So if we take the actual rents, which average $744 a square foot, and it's funny because if you take the aggregate of the offices and the warehouse, well, now it actually falls right in that range. It all kind of plays out and makes sense. 744 a square foot. We've got the market vacancy allowance and shortfall and non-recovered. No problem. We come to an NOI of 206,085. And then the last question is, what is the rate of return somebody wants in this property? If the floor is 6% for Class B, and we've already identified that there are some funny things about this property that may cause that unease I talked about, I don't see the cap rate being 6%. It has to be higher. And I think, again, I'm being rather optimistic at 6.25%. And if we use those rates and allowances, which I think all pass the test of logic, we come to a value of $3,310,000. And yes, I am aware that appears less than the sale price. And I have to step back and say, well, does that make sense? And I had talked about this sale earlier when I thought it was the other property. It was this property. It was part of a portfolio in multiple locations, multiple properties. And one thing I know that the IAAO standards teach assessors and the Appraisal Institute teaches appraisers is that's a flag. You have to consider that that may not be an exact indicator of the property itself's value. It's a component of a larger piece. Doesn't mean it's not at market. Doesn't mean that at all. It means that we got to step back and take a closer look. Well, that's exactly what the income approach does. And I think that's what's interesting about the income approach. It's a real good test to see if other things make sense. And so my conclusion is, Madam Chair, that I do not put all weight on that portfolio sale, component of a portfolio sale. And I think our income approach is tested and approved to be a better indicator of April 23 market value. Thank you.
Mr. Slaughter, sorry, just looking at your brief, you've got a NOI of 211,965.
Is it again? I think I'm making last minute adjustments here. I apologize, Madam Chair. I will stay with the value as shown. Yes, 211. Why is the difference though? Let me try and find out why. I can't explain why that. I have all the same numbers here, except the NOI is different. So I'll just simplify this by saying the higher is what I'll ask for. 211,965 is the NOI, capitalized at 6.25%.
Okay, but then your value we have at 3,391,000.
That's correct. I accept my original value. I don't know what happened on my spreadsheet here. I'll look closer as we finish up. Something different in the calculation.
All right, I thank you. Mr. Fourget, questions?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Anderson?
I have no questions. Thanks for your presentation.
And Mr. Stephenson?
No questions at this time, thank you.
Thank you. I also have no questions. Does either party have a wish for a summation?
No, thank you.
No summation, Madam Chair. I saw my error in my brief, which again, I stand by the value and live by the mistake. I accidentally put in a 3% vacancy allowance.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we will now move on to our last item, which is item number 8, which is 1830 Dublin Avenue. Again, we are looking at assessed value, and Mr. Forget, whenever you are ready.
Sure. So the property is 1830 Dublin Avenue. The roll number is 07569021500. And the original 2025 assessment is $3,929,000. I do have another recommendation here. So I'm proposing reducing the assessment to $3,442,000. And that's based on a reduction in the rental rates. And so the NOI would be 253,001, and that would bring us to our when capitalized would bring us to the value of $3,442,000.
All right. What is the reduced rent, Mr. Forget?
So there are 3 units. The overall reduction would take the blended rent from $623 to $548.
And your cap rate remains the same?
Correct.
All right, thank you. Mr. Slaughter, are you willing to accept this reduction?
I am, Madam Chair, with the caveat, and so Mr. Fougier is aware that I still do need to approve this with the owner. 95% of the time when we explain our rationale, the owner will accept, but there is the exception where the owner may not. So, Jamie, if you're okay with that, I'll let you know immediately if for some reason they don't like it.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. So, and just to explain the rationale, Madam Chair, the property is an older property, 1960s vintage, I believe. It's really at the end of Dublin, on Sherwin Road. So it's kind of a little further back. The city has applied a 7.35% cap rate, which is right in the range that we would be aiming. So that's great. So the discrepancy between Mr. Fougier and I was simply on the market rent. There's 3 tenants. 2 of them have arm's length leases, which are fairly close to the reference date, and I think are representative of all the factors of the property. They make sense. The 3rd tenant is the owner, Inlet Equipment. So I had made a subjective application of a market rent for that space, and I could probably explain to the owner that I was maybe a little aggressive, and that if I applied $7.50 a square foot, which you've been hearing over and over again is kind of the average in this area, if I apply that to their unit, I come out at Jamie's number exactly. So that's the reason why in this case I think Mr. Fougier has presented a very fair offer, and I think the owner would accept it.
All right. So you are saying you're accepting it?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Ms. Anderson, did you have any questions regarding this?
Just in regards to the, I do have one question. Just in regards to the cap rate, Mr. Fougier, 7.35. So that's much higher than the previous cap rates that we've seen. I recognize the building's a lot older. Location, is there any other factors that would drive that cap rate higher than the others that you can share with us?
Yeah, I believe so. So if you take a look at the second page of my brief, you can see the aerial photography of the building, and it's really almost maximized their lot or their site entirely. The loading docks are facing Dublin Avenue, and it's sort of like almost like a wide driveway there, so they can back in off of Dublin. But aside from that, there's really only sort of single parking spaces around parts of the building. And so there really is no yard for any additional storage, any additional development, or use of the site. that they might require beyond having those loading docks be accessible. So I would say land to building ratio would be the other reason.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for your presentation. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Mr. Stephenson, any questions?
No questions at this time, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Forget, I just have one quick question. On your brief, you've got for your wall height on this property, 12 to 20. I'm assuming the retail portion is the 12 and the 4 loading docks off to the side are the 20?
Correct. If you want to just bear with me for just one moment, I think the majority is at the 20. I just wanted to verify that. So we have, the 12-foot ceilings are for a small amount of area, 3,554 square feet. So really, it's sort of probably along. You can see sort of the lower spot. If you look at the second page of my brief, along Dublin Avenue, where they have the windows there for the offices, and then I think the roof is stepped up once you get past that immediate front area. And so the rest of the building is 17, which is still lower, obviously, than what we're seeing of 20 or higher. And that's 25,000 square feet. And then we have 22,000 square feet at 20. So somewhere about half the building or between a third and half the building is at the sort of warehouse height of 20 feet. And then a good sized portion of it is at 17, a little bit lower.
All right. I thank you for that. And I'm going to assume, gentlemen, neither of you wish for any summation on this property.
No, thank you.
So all the items on our docket have been heard this morning. And I would like to thank you both, Mr. Slaughter and Mr. Forget, for your presentations, as always.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bye.
Bye.
And this hearing is adjourned.